You're listening to DraftKings Network.
I want to talk about the game that I saw in its entirety that I didn't fall asleep for, which was the Rose Bowl game presented by Prudential Insurance. Number one, I don't need to see the marching bands. I love all the traditions there, but give me Walk the Moon doing Shut Up and Dance. I don't need to see the bands. The bands aren't doing
Man
much
of the hour.
But it's part of the experience, much like, the sundown and all that.
You've heard one, you've heard them all.
I get it.
Exactly. They're all playing the same song.
There's just way more memeable moments if Jack Harlow's playing at halftime.
Tony hasn't gotten a word in edgewise for the entire show, and he just muttered "Band of the Hour" in the Zagacki voice.
Band of the hour.
I don't mean any offense.
Brought to you by
I don't mean any offense to the Alabama Crimson Tide marching band. It's just not. When they're talking, the few conversations that I've been around when they're talking about marching bands, Alabama's marching band hasn't come up. Just give me whatever pop artist du jour is there for a halftime show, and I'm good with that. But I want to talk about the end of that game because a lot of people had the knee-jerk reaction out of a timeout, out of two timeouts. That's the play call? Bad play call. Terrible play call. No, it wasn't. It was a great play call.
Saban was so good in that game.
They had a bad snap, as they had all game. And they say game of inches, and it's little things. And that game, both teams were taking turns, blowing up almost entirely the little things that can put you over the edge in a game, in a very close matchup.
It was a low snap, so it was supposed to be an RPO. And if you watch the play back, because I've done so on Twitter here a couple of times, everything was open for Alabama, but he got frightened and just ran straight into the line.
And you can understand why he gets frightened because it's a low snap, and that changes the timing up on everything there. And I think you're asking for unbelievable poise there. But not to toot my own horn, in the moment, I thought it was a good play call. And that's with their line being pretty devastated all night by the Michigan line. You're going to call an offensive line play here in the final moments, but if you see, he has a pulling guard. All he has to do is follow his blocks. Now, that blows up the second the snap is bad, and he just runs straight into the back of the guard there. But he had the blocking assignment right there for him, and it would have been a great play call by Tommy Rees.
Mike, I think it was 55 Graham who they were talking about on the broadcast a ton because he was just in the backfield 24/7. But he pushes back on a bull rush on the guard so quickly that by the time that Milroe gets the ball and runs up, he's getting leg whipped by the offensive
You guys
lineman.
have to understand that what I saw in that game is Michigan up front manhandling them. That's what I'm not used to with Alabama. We can do the storyline of Saban over the last 10 years, the arc. The amazing thing that he did is win championships because he didn't have a quarterback. Before A.J. McCarron, it was an assembly line of people who weren't actually any good, who were close to winning the Heisman the way Gino Torretta did. 19 touchdown passes, 59% completion rate, because he had all the best athletes all the time. That gap is closed and closed so much that what stood out to me is Alabama was an underdog and should be. Milroe cannot run the ball. 11 carries for -2 yards early in the game because they're getting mauled up front. Michigan is clearly stronger on both sides of the up front, but their offense is limited, and the coaching is allowing Saban to stay in a game where I think Michigan's got better players, not better skill guys necessarily, but it was the uniforms that could trick you. But Alabama should have been an underdog in that game.
And McCarthy has NFL prospects, but I also watched that game, and I kind of felt like both teams were doing the best that they could with the limitations that they have at quarterback. Now, I like Jalen Milroe. He still has a way to go, and if he improves next year, year over year, the way that he did just in this season alone, they're going to have a really good player on their hands. But McCarthy had a very difficult time, and you saw a lot of players who it doesn't always work out the way that it does for Michigan, where they get embarrassed by TCU in that they lost, and everyone pointed to the national championship game saying TCU didn't even belong in there. Well, they got there by beating Michigan. And Corum comes back. Roman Wilson makes tremendous play after tremendous play. That ball that J.J. McCarthy had batted near at the line that changed the trajectory of that. And Roman Wilson, who was a scapegoat earlier on that drive,
great play,
pulling that ball down the way that he did.
Saves the entire season.
Saves their season. I thought it was a great game.
After they got out-coached. Stugotz, I'm telling you, what I was watching yesterday impressed the holy hell out of me with Nick Saban losing. Now, Michigan did it.
Best coaching job he's ever done.
Michigan did on that last drive against Saban's defense and against a game's worth of information, Michigan did what they had to do to rescue their season. But what they did in overtime, handing the ball off and just scoring on 2 plays, they mauled them up front. Alabama doesn't have the advantages it has had. The gap is closed, and now what Saban can do in the margins is, yeah, he'll outcoach you, but he'll lose by 7 in overtime because his quarterback, who Bill O'Brien said shouldn't be a quarterback, panicked at the end.
He doesn't trust that quarterback.
No, but shouldn't.
Panicked because it was a terrible snap. But we don't know the center's name.
No, but I'm talking after Michigan missed a field goal and Alabama had a chance to put the game away. It would have been over if they scored 7. They did it. They scored they kicked a field goal. He was very conservative in that drive because Saban does not trust that quarterback. I'm not certain he'll be the quarterback next year for Alabama.
He's around that quarterback all the time. If he decides, and he's trusted quarterbacks.
That quarterback has won a lot of games for him, Mike.
He's had many, Stugotz.
This year, Dan.
But Stugotz, the reason I thought Alabama wasn't any good is because they lost by 2 touchdowns at home to Texas in a game where that quarterback looked incompetent. It looked to me, going into South Florida, like Alabama was going to have a 4 or 5 loss season because they didn't have a quarterback, and because the gap had been erased, all these other teams got here quickly with money, and it's not what it used to be. He will have a coaching advantage, but he doesn't have a talent advantage anymore. And I say again, Stugotz, Georgia would have been favored against all 4 of the remaining teams. The money, when the gambling and information was exchanged, the money would have been on the best team in this sport is not Alabama. It is not Michigan. It is not Washington. It would have been Georgia as a favorite against everybody. That's what Nick Saban was an underdog in these playoffs and should have been. You have to be impressed by him beating Georgia. I don't think anyone else could do it. I think he's the only human being on earth who could have beaten Georgia.
Michigan doesn't beat Georgia?
I don't think
they'd have a chance.
They wouldn't be favored. They would not be favored against Georgia. They'll be favored against Alabama, but I would be curious what the spread would be in that game, but it wouldn't be Georgia as an underdog.
Yeah. Michigan's an extremely good team, and I think given what we saw yesterday and what we'll see in the national championship game, if it goes their way, that's undoubtedly a great Michigan team. And I know it's technically a Pac-12 team this year, but that team's headed to the Big Ten. And I think a lot of the SEC stuff it's only going to get worse with ESPN having the SEC rights and the Big Ten basically being the other guys now. Puts ESPN in an interesting predicament because they're incentivized to bang the drum for the SEC more than they already have.
But you say this is obviously a Michigan team that will have as reputation one of the best that there's ever been because Michigan doesn't often play for the national championship. And under Harbaugh, Stugotz, you've been tough on Harbaugh. Like you've said that he's been a failure.
Well, he has.
But if not for Michigan, Ohio State, with a bowl game that doesn't mean very much because you get a lot of opt-outs, but Ohio State lost. Their one loss was barely against Michigan, and they lost to the 3rd best SEC team. Penn State got dragged by Lane Kiffin. Like, that was embarrassing to watch, where I'm looking at both of the athletes on both sides of the field, and I'm watching that Lane Kiffin is toying with James Franklin playing conservative ball while he's handing it to fat guys and have them throw passes because he's not at all scared of the kind of football that they play because it's not the kind of football they play in the SEC. That Michigan would beat what I believe to be a weakened Alabama team does not make me believe in Michigan. They may indeed be able to maul Washington up front because Washington's defense isn't very good. And they may maul their way to a championship. But that style of football they play in that conference, it will fall behind the SEC. Like, they will not be able to keep up with whatever Texas and Oklahoma become when they get into the big money conference. It's going to look like handoff ball, and you're not going to be able to win against these offenses from the future with a bunch of athletes mauling your way on the offensive and defensive line. Like, this isn't sustainable. That conference pales compared to the SEC. It does, obviously.
As 2 Big Ten teams are about to play for the national championship.
Yes.
It's kind of weird. You're not looking at the landscape of football. If all this talent is being spread out through all the other conferences, yeah, give me the ones with the lines because they don't have the lines now.
It's funny. I'm reading a quote here, and Brady agreed. Harbaugh said that J.J. McCarthy's the best quarterback in Michigan history. And Brady, being the humble Brady, said, yeah, I agree, go blue. Harbaugh never saw Elvis Gerbeck. I mean, thank you.
At 8-8, the Seahawks will clinch a playoff berth if they win plus a Packers loss or tie, or Seahawks tie plus Packers loss plus Buccaneers loss or tie, or Seahawks tie plus Packers loss plus Saints loss or tie.
Oh, wow. Again, once a tie comes in there, I just totally get lost.
Has it been one all season? Yeah.